He's actually older than me. He's the Director of Medical Oncology at Royal Hobart Hospital, where we both practice, and he's been such for about 25 years. He's a full professor in the Health Science Faculty in Medicine. He's been the President of the Tasmanian branch of the Australian Medical Association. He's a past President of the Cancer Council of Australia. He has in fact been awarded an officership in the Order of Australia, so he would have been Sir Ray Lowenthal if he'd actually been born 20 years before. He's best known for his work in leukemia research amongst his medical colleagues, and he did a wonderful bit of research about 10 years ago showing that living under power lines actually didn't cause cancer. In Tasmania he's known as the voice of reason and science with compassion. I give you Professor Ray Lowenthal.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you everybody. It's a delight to be here. I thought I'd start with a series of little cartoons that appeared in that august and otherwise very staid journal, The Lancet, which showed a series of 6 cartoons which has shown how medical practice has changed over the years. So this is from 700 AD, that root is heathen. Recite this prayer. Whoops, what do I do? Okay, so we go back to BC. Here, chew this root. 700 AD, this root is heathen, recite this prayer. 1860 AD, that prayer is superstition, sip this potion. 1940, that potion is snake juice, swallow this pill. 1988, the pill is ineffective, take this antibiotic. 2005, the antibiotic's artificial, chew this root. Well, we talk about quacks as a kind of slang for people who are purveying medicines which Barry has very delightfully termed as bogus. The term is actually quite interesting. It comes from the 17th century, short for a hawker who sold quicksilver or mercury as a cure for syphilis. So that's the so-called quack solve. And as Barry says, this problem's been with us for a long time. And go back to the 19th century, there's any number of advertisements in the lay press of one kind or another. Snake oil treatment, here's another snake oil liniment, one of which you probably can't read that, but that said it cures swellings. Which, so I guess even back in the 19th century people were trying to cure cancer with snake oil and things like it. I won't go through complementary alternatives to save me a little time with my talk because Barry already covered that. But this is a paper of Dr. Castle herself from 2001, looking at complementary alternative medicine use around the world. One of the interesting phenomena about these different treatments is that they do have a kind of regional focus. There are some things which are used very widely, but other things are very regional. And SCH, for example, which Barry mentioned, has hardly ever been taken up in Australia for some reason, but we have our own methods, which I'll mention. And there are big studies very similar to the ones you've already been shown to indicate that Australians, just the same as people in America or Europe or wherever, have a very high use of complementary alternative medicines. Mostly they don't tell their doctors because there are all sorts of reasons they think the doctors will scold them and they don't want to hear it. One interesting statistic which was published in 2002 is that Australians spend about 4 times as much in complementary alternative medicine as on the patient contributions to the government subsidised PBS spending. One of the big myths in all this, of course, is that anything natural is harmless. The latest thing is I was in Woolworths the other day and they actually said, where there's now a big thing with a bottle of water, they had natural water. I want to know what's unnatural. So anything with the word natural on it, well, is natural always harmless? Well, snakes are natural. Sharks are natural. Tobacco's natural. Actually, tobacco and alcohol are vegetarian. And when people talk about the pharmaceutical industry purveying unnatural chemicals, in fact, a a large number of the medicines which we use are actually derived from plants. For example, on the right-hand side there, aspirin comes from the willow bark, morphine on the left there from the opium poppy, and then drugs that we use in cancer treatment, vincristine comes from the Madagascar periwinkle, etoposide from the mandrake plant, and Taxol and Taxotere, which are very widely used in cancer pharmaceuticals, derived from the Pacific yew tree in California. One of the experiences I had a few years ago, which sort of opened my eyes up a bit to the way people think who are not trained in science, was that I was having a discussion with a patient about her interest in one or other particular alternative treatments for cancer. And I remember saying to her that the scientific evidence is that this particular treatment doesn't work. And she said to me, but that's only scientific evidence. and the fact of the matter is that for people, there are many different forms of evidence that people accept, and I've listed some of them there, particularly the wisdom of the ancients, and of course what people read about in the media, and authority figures and so on. And one of the things people often don't appreciate is that for any treatment that you give to anybody and any disease, whether you're treated or not, there's a survival curve. So what this shows is that if the average survival, if this is years along here, this is the number up there, if the average survival is so much, say 2 years, there'll be some people who do worse than the average and some people who do better than the average. And people read that the 5-year survival of a certain cancer is 50%. People often think that means everyone lives for 5 years and then they suddenly all drop dead. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about statistics out there, and it is quite a difficult issue for, I personally find it, to translate statistics into a meaningful way so people can understand. And often the misunderstanding of statistics is one reason I think that people go rushing off to look at alternatives where they are promised the world and told that this is how their disease can be cured. I came back to Australia after having partly trained overseas in the UK in 1975, and the older people here will remember a newspaper called The Truth, the pages of which were filled with mainly with sex and various scandals of one kind or another. And you wonder how a newspaper based on that could run out of business and go bankrupt. But at that time it was flourishing. And the headlines at that time were, in the Truth, were all about this miracle cancer cure. And they're based on the claims of a person called Milan Brick, who had come out to Australia, or actually come to New Zealand, as a result of the uprising in Czechoslovakia. So the older people in the audience will remember the uprising in Czechoslovakia. At the time, Europe was divided into the Western and the communist blocs, and the uprising in Czechoslovakia, the Russian tanks moved in, and amongst other people who left and came to this part of the world was a chap called Milan Brick. So let me tell you how his story from Czechoslovakia to New Zealand to the Cook Islands, which is a little Pacific island, to California. He arrived in New Zealand as a refugee and claimed to be a cancer expert. He didn't have papers with him, but he said that's because he had to flee the country in such a rush. When the authorities tried to check on his credentials by looking up the University of Prague, he wasn't in there, but he said that's because he'd acted as an anti-communist and they'd removed his name from the university's register, and in the sort of paranoia of the time and McCarthyism, whatever he was believed. He was registered in New Zealand as a doctor, worked in a cancer centre and claimed he had a secret cure for cancer, which at that time cost people $3,800, which you could probably put an extra zero on to come to today's dollars. But he made these claims, they got a lot of publicity, and people from not only New Zealand but Australia started rushing over there to be treated for it. The orthodox medical establishment looked into his credentials, concluded that he wasn't a doctor, and in fact what he had been in Czechoslovakia, as here, he actually spent time in jail as a con man. He was obviously a very charismatic figure and was able to, he worked partly part-time as a, or partly as a laboratory scientist, so he knew a lot of the words and was able to persuade people that he was genuine. So he was struck off, but then he appealed and went back on the New Zealand Register until 1977, when finally, after nearly 10 years, the New Zealand Supreme Court decided that he was a doctor, not a doctor, but a criminal. So he then moved to the Cook Islands and set up his own clinic there in the Cook Islands, and again we had people, patients of mine, a lot of patients who were selling their houses to get the money to go to the Cook Islands, as if the only place in the world that knew how to treat cancer was the Cook Islands. You know, I think it doesn't take a lot of, it doesn't take a sort of rocket science to work out that that's extremely unlikely to be correct. And in fact, what he was doing, he was treating people. There's so many people died in under his care that they renamed the local cemetery the Brickyard. Nonetheless, his cause was taken up by Joe Nyorki-Peterson, who was from Queensland, and by a great deal of luck, and actually I have to say by the ministers of health of Queensland and the federal government at that time that blocked it. But in fact, there was a very serious move to get him to come to Queensland and set his clinic up there. He then fled to the Cook Islands, as I said. After that, there was actually a change of government in the Cook Islands. He was granted an MD by the Cook Islands Parliament, so he didn't have one. And there was then a change of government, which was actually fought over whether or not he was able to be to stay in the Cook Islands and continue to practice. When the government actually changed, he went to California, but he couldn't change his habits, and he was finally jailed in California for practicing medicine without a license. So this is the worst kind of charlatan bogus treatment. This chap clearly knew that what he was doing was not correct. He fleeced large numbers of people out of large amounts of money. And he's a contrast to the next person I want to tell you about. And one of the problems with this whole system was the media. I think the media had a lot to answer for here because he was strongly promoted by the truth, so-called truth. And in fact, when it was clear that he was bogus and a charlatan, the truth never attracted anything else. A rather different kettle of fish is a chap called Egan Gawler, who I'm sure a number of you have heard of. He's a vet who at the age of veterinary scientist who at the age of 23 developed a cancer of the bones and had his leg amputated. He subsequently developed symptoms and some signs that suggest that he might have had secondary cancer, although that's not necessarily true. He was unfortunately told by some medical practitioner that he had 2 weeks to live, whereupon he took himself to India, sat under a bow tree and worked out how to cure cancer, and subsequently wrote a book about it which has been extremely influential. It's gone through many, many editions in this country and sold at least 100,000 copies, I believe, a few years ago, and set up a clinic. And his ideas were largely that you could think your cancer away by meditating. And I've read his book and I've actually written about it. And these are the sort of statements that he's written, that meditation is the single most powerful tool to aid recovery from disease. Now, in fact, meditation does help people do certain things, but it certainly doesn't cure cancer. He also recommended a whole lot of other things. Some of I won't read through there. You can see there the sort of things he said. Some things were right. He said avoid nicotine. He also said avoid caffeine, chocolate, sexual excess. Interesting. I don't know how you decide whether you have to drink spring or rainwater, and don't use a microwave oven. One of the things he pushed very hard is coffee enemas. You're not allowed to drink coffee. I got into this myself. His influence over was so strong back in the 1980s that large numbers of patients in Australia were truly abandoning their effective treatments, or at the very least spending a lot of time meditating. And I just remember one particular example of one chap who was persuaded by his family that he should sit in a corner and meditate, try and think his cancer away. And he said to me, really what I want to do is spend time with my granddaughter. And so people, you might think that meditating is harmless, but when it's pushed to this kind of way, it can actually do harm. It takes people away from their family and relationships. If people meditate and the cancer comes back, they get guilt feelings. One extension of this whole idea is that parents should meditate, so I think hard to make their children's cancer go away, and that people have brought their cancer on themselves through bad or evil thoughts, and these ideas can create a lot of guilt feelings and a lot of distress in patients, and particularly, as I've seen it in parents of patients with cancer. So these ideas are not as harmless as you might think. On the right there is the book I wrote, because I thought if someone who doesn't know anything about it can write a book, I could do it too. His book has got about 20 editions, mine's got 2. He sold well over 100,000, I sold about 5,000. The strength of the interest in these things. Laetrile comes and goes. Barry's already mentioned this. It's an extract of apricot pips, contains cyanide, and it's propounded on the theory that cancer cells can't stand the cyanide, can't withstand the effect of cyanide and apricot pips, whereas normal cells can. Well, again, if only it were that easy, and unfortunately it's not that easy, but it's also claimed, the proponents of this are very clever. They claim it to be a vitamin, and therefore by implication something which everybody needs. There's no such thing as a vitamin B17, and the last thing you need is cyanide or apricot. And again, the cancer conspiracy theory is strongly pushed. It was widely taken, and its heyday is actually, because of the internet, is actually coming back. This is something which was again very popular back in the 1980s. This is an international phenomenon, and it's been coming back. It's bad in the USA, as said, but Tijuana, which Barry's already mentioned, is a kind of epicenter in North America anyway for a lot of these treatments, and I've had patients who've gone from here to Tijuana to be treated by this. And I won't go through this, but there have been studies which clearly show it's useless, and obviously shouldn't be used. Now, the Tasmanians in this audience here will know who this is. This is a former Premier of Tasmania, Jim Bacon, who died a couple of years ago now from lung cancer. He'd been a smoker, and there was this famous headline in the Mercury when he announced that he actually had lung cancer. Now, he was very prominent. He was at the time very popular. He was probably at the height of his career, and he got hundreds of well-wishing letters when it became known that he had this disease. Among them were 160 letters giving medical or health advice, which were passed on to me by Jim and his wife Honey, because he had no interest in sort of reading the sort of things that people were advising. But I was able to analyse the letters that were sent to him, and I think it's interesting to see what sort of things people out there are proposing, promoting, and advising. There are a whole lot of letters. These are some of the claims in the letters. That most cancer patients die of their chemotherapy. All cancers involve parasites. 2 things kill cancer patients: lack of information and blind faith in the medical profession. The natural therapy helped my wife's menstrual condition. And some people said the Premier of Tasmania before someone, and some people said that they would like to recruit him to help sell these treatments, and they would pay him for doing it. These are the sorts of conspiracy theories that are about that orthodox medicine involves cutting, burning, and poisoning. Cutting is surgery, burning is radiation, and poisoning with drugs. Well, there's no doubt a lot of the drugs we use are quite toxic. The claims are that this is all they do and have no benefits. So what I'm going to show you here in a series of slides, which I'll go through fairly quickly, are some of the things that these 167 letters propose. It actually comes to more than 167 methods, because some of them advise more more than one method. There also were about 25 different books, which I'm not showing you, because many of them the kind of thing that Barry's already shown you. I've used headings proposed by various people as to how to divide up the complementary and alternative treatments. So here, for example, are recommendations for mind, body and spirit methods, meditation, visualisation, having a positive attitude, which is an interesting one we might talk about later on. The one I like is humour therapy, and I'm all for that. But the idea that you can cure your cancer or make cancer shrink by what you think about it is just, I mean, anyone who knows the first thing about cancer biology would know that this is just completely outrageous and impossible. But to a person, people who don't know any biology, thinking pure thoughts and having lovely sort of visualisations of palm trees on the ocean and whatever, people like to think that would help. It might help people be calm, it might help people be relaxed, it might help them cope with the exigencies of the treatment, because there's no doubt cancer treatment is a tough road to go down, but meditation, visualisation don't make you cancer shrink, unfortunately. Manual healing and physical touch methods, Dr. John Holt I'm going to come back to, hypothermia, and then we have Lee Croc's aura therapy, an energy cleaning machine, Dr. Beck's blood zapper, magnetic pulsar, Rathwell's negative ion mat, biomagnetic therapy, microbeams. So these are the kind of suggestions people made, and in some cases people were selling them. What they wanted to treat Tasmania to buy this. Herbs and vitamins, Laetrile was very common. This is only 2 years ago. There was a thing called glyconutrients, I'll come back to, various vitamins, proposed mushrooms of one kind or another, various herbs, you can see them there, coffee enemas, and antioxidants. Actually, antioxidants are interesting. Again, I'm going to come back to that. Bee pollen, there's a whole list of things there. Sea cucumbers, Mongolian tea, anything from far away. Various diets, all sorts of juices. You can buy juices, you can buy special machines to juice your vegetables and fruit. They're obviously, apparently the juice is better if it gets the energy out of these special machines. Flaxseed oil, noni juice, and yogurt of one kind or another. There's the grape cure. Well, I'm all for grapes, especially the fermented kind, that cure your cancer is another myth. Various diet and nutrition methods, again I won't read them, you can run your eyes down them, but just look at all the different things. There's clearly no consensus amongst people, but a lot of different ideas. For example, there's a white fruit diet, which is only eat things that are white. There's a green food diet. There's licorice, which is a black food diet. Classic, which is a no food diet. All these things were suggested. Colloidal silver and various other things there, including books, including Percy's powder. Vanadium fuel, coenzyme Q, a whole lot of things. Chinese medicine was suggested, well of course there's a lot of good in Chinese medicine, but people were suggesting that we should abandon Western medicine and go to Chinese and various other systems there. The most popular suggestions in summary were meditation, glyconutrients, so-called Chinese medicine, juices, Laetrile, herbs of one kind, and mushrooms. Meditation, again, I think we've covered this and I can probably skip through this quickly. There's no trials that show survival benefit. Excessive use, as I mentioned, can distract from other activities, and there's a question of this very noxious blame the victim attitude, which people try hard to think their cancer away and it doesn't work. Glyconutrients was complete news to me when I went through this. I wasn't aware that this is something which is so popular. Glycoproteins are sugar-containing proteins which are found everywhere in the body. Why they should be a treatment for cancer, I don't know. They're often sold by pyramid-selling organisations. The commercial ones, they're extracted from mushrooms and mistletoe and various other things. Mistletoe has been a popular ancient remedy for cancer for many years. Many studies show it's ineffective but probably harmless. There's no other evidence for the others, but this is an expensive way of just eating sugar-containing proteins which are in your food anyway. Chinese medicine, many different types. Some herbs certainly do show promise, and I know Barry amongst others is researching these. But and we do actually, and it's also not true to say that Western medicine ignores what goes on in China or other places. There's a drug called all-trans-retinoic acid, which was developed in China from ancient remedies, and which is in fact an extremely effective anti-leukemia drug, which is widely used in the West, and was very quickly adopted when the evidence became available that it worked. So it's not true to say that we ignore and don't use it. Juices, there's a chap called Gerson who wrote a book in the 1930s that said if you have 13 juices a day prepared in a special juicer and 4 coffee enemas a day, you can cure migraine and TB. Obviously, if it cures migraine and TB, it will also cure cancer. So people have extended this. In fact, this is also quite dangerous. It can disturb the body's salts and cause dehydration and nutritional deficiency. But people have gone into this big time too. Noni juice comes from Tahiti, so it must be good because it's far away. Noni juice will cure all those things, including cancer. Cancer's only one. I gather it tastes disgusting, so I hope people don't take too much of it, but this is available in Australia and people are spending money on it. The mushrooms, this is quite interesting. That they may, who knows, there could well be something in this. There is a single interesting case report in the orthodox medical literature, but it hasn't been properly studied yet, and this is an unproven remedy. Antioxidants are quite an interesting thing. Vitamin E and beta-carotene were studied, a big study in the 1990s from Finland, where they gave these antioxidants to smokers to try to prevent lung cancer. The hypothesis was the substance would act as antioxidants and thus prevent their cancer. But I personally want to be a bit direct. I don't understand why antioxidants are good for you. Isn't oxygen good for you? At any rate, what they found in this study was the subjects receiving the active substances had a higher rate of lung cancer than those on placebo. So that no matter how good it sounds, unless you do the study, you don't know what the real answer is. Shark cartilage has been widely promoted. And there's a book written that sharks don't get cancer. First of all, how do you study it? How do you study it? But in fact, sharks that they've kept in aquariums do get cancer, so it's actually not even true. This was studied by the American Cancer Society, and the proponents were fined $1 million by the American FDA and told to stop promoting this. Nonetheless, I had a lot of patients who went off to buy it. And there's been a recent study, more recently, there's actually been a paper published that showed clearly that these things don't work. Dr. Holder, many of you will remember, this is a recent thing in Australia. He's an elderly Perth radiation oncologist who advocated something he called combined microwave therapy. He's had, over the years, the patronage of prominent politicians and the media. This is another one where the media have a lot to answer. And he described it. And again, as Barry has said, there's a lot of scientific mumbo-jumbo goes along with these promotions. He described what he was using as a 434 megahertz ultra-high frequency radio waves with glucose blocking. Well, if you know nothing about science, it might sound impressive. If you know anything about science at all, it is complete gobbledygook. But nonetheless, this is a sort of, it sounds impressive to some people, and he was making all sorts of claims. He caused such disruption, this now we're only talking about 2 years ago, he caused a lot of disruption in cancer clinics in Australia, and I had lots of my own patients who wanted to go there and be treated by him. That the federal government felt obliged to mount a study to see whether or not this treatment worked. This was the review which was published just over 2 years ago now, the report to the minister. This study took over a year and cost $250,000, which could have been better spent many other ways. And their conclusion, which were entirely predictable to anybody who knew anything about it, were that there's no quality scientific evidence to support the claims. The method was actually found to be inferior to standard treatments, and in a variety of cancers. Nonetheless, people up till then were rushing off to Perth, Western Australia. So these things happen in Australia as well as elsewhere. Just finally, as Barry has mentioned, just a few days ago in Adelaide, there was this heading in the Adelaide Advertiser, where there was a story about, and in this case, at least the media was on the side of the good and the right, that they reported three deaths of patients who had gone to, well, you have to call them a quack, who promoted so-called ozone therapy for these patients who had cancer. So this is where they were using this as an alternative to the real thing, and they all died. And I personally witnessed patients like this. It's so sad, particularly breast cancer, perhaps more than anything else. But breast cancer these days is such a treatable disease, and I've seen patients with progressive horrible disease where they've gone off to be treated by ozone or whatever else is the flavour of the month. Sometimes these things are sold as vitamin O, or oxygen drops, which is actually H2O. And despite the claims of the proponents, these treatments are not necessary. I mean, some of them may well be safe, but they have to be studied to find out whether they're safe or not. For example, a lot of unbalanced diets can definitely cause malnutrition. One of the ideas that people have is that they should become vegetarians once they get cancer. Certainly getting a serious disease like cancer makes people consider what they do. Have I done anything to bring it on? Is there anything I can do to help the other treatment? And a very common form of action is for people to adjust their diet and change their diet. Maybe take vitamin pills, maybe have. And people have heard that vegetarian diets are good for you. There's no doubt at all. There's lots of studies which show that vegetarians do indeed, on average, have a lower rate of cancer than people who eat meat. There's no doubt about that. But one of the difficulties in studying this is people who are vegetarians, on the whole, have a greater interest in their health generally than non-vegetarians. And it's often hard to dissect out what part the vegetarian diet itself plays as along with moderation, alcohol, not smoking, exercise and all the other things. Nonetheless, there have been studies, for example, the Seventh-day Adventists, where the strict ones who are purely vegetarian have a lower rate of cancer than the not so strict ones who in turn have a lower rate of cancer than the general public. But if somebody at the age of 60 who's never had a vegetarian diet suddenly decides to adopt one, they can run into all sorts of problems. If you think that a vegetarian diet is a normal diet with the meat taken away, you'll end up with a very unbalanced diet. So people have to, and also vegetarian diets involve a much greater bulk of food than do diets that are not vegetarian. And often eating a big bulky meal is something which is very difficult for patients who are sick with cancer. And so they can easily become malnourished. So again, all these ideas which you might think superficially are bound to be helpful, that can be more harmful than it first appears. I mentioned cyanide poisoning from laboratory. There are cases of that, electrolyte imbalances. As mentioned, various herbs can interfere with standard medical treatments. After all, these herbs work in their pharmaceuticals, and so they have to be studied. They can't be taken with impunity. There's a lot of uncertainty about herbal preparations. They don't always contain what they claim to contain. And the most serious danger is that people who take these treatments up may use them as alternatives to effective treatment rather than complementary. I've listed here myself the websites which people should look at, and I would strongly recommend the Memorial Sloan Kettering website, which Barry Capital has set up. This is undoubtedly the premier website about herbs, which you can read. It's extremely authoritative. Barry tells me she has 2 people working full time on this, keeping it up to date, so it's a very worthwhile website to look up, and contains information about a very large number of herbs. There's others, Quackwatch, which has also been mentioned, which is a good one to look up. The National Centre for Conflict Prevention and Alternative Medicine, and we've got the US government side, another one called the Natural Database. So there's quite a few of these where you can get authoritative information. I've done my own Google search. If you put the word cancer into Google, you get about 200 million hits. 200 million. So there's no doubt at all that it's very, you can see how easy it is for people to get misled and get taken to the wrong sites. There's another one. So I apologise to people who have already seen this. This is my old joke that I've done. This, those of you who hers, but I've got my own recommendation for complementary alternative medicine. It fulfills all the criteria. It's a perfectly natural substance. It was introduced to the West only in the 16th century from an ancient and now vanished civilization who obviously had a lot of wisdom. There's no record of cancer amongst this ancient civilization. It's been known for eons to have magical properties. Ingestion gave us warrior strength. Prior to planting its seeds, men had to abstain from sex for 10 days, so it shows you how powerful this is. What is it? It's Theobroma cacao, which is the food of the gods, introduced to Europe in the 16th century. Everybody I know who's been cured of cancer has eaten this. It's chocolate.
Thank you, Ray. And now we have 10 minutes for questions, and I see,
My question to Professor Lothwell is in three parts. Firstly, I get the impression from both talks this afternoon that bogus treatments are perhaps better regulated in the USA than they are here. Is that true? And secondly, is there a case for better government regulation of bogus cancer treatments in Australia? And thirdly, is part of the problem that so-called alternative medicine is so popular now that the political parties are scared of upsetting the voters and that the genie is out of the bottle?
Well, to answer the last question first, I think that's partly true. It's not just the governments and the regulators, it's also the medical profession. I think that there's a lot of concern about how do we deal with this with our own patients. Do we tiptoe lightly around it for fear of offending our patients and sending them elsewhere? Or do we tell our patients, do we say to the patient, you're completely stupid for doing this? There's a lot of diffidence about how to deal with this, a lot of uncertainty. My paper, which I published in the Medical Journal of Australia about 20 years ago now, about Ian Gawler's book, I know for a fact received a lot of letters, but the editor of the Medical Journal of Australia at the time decided not to publish those letters for fear of inflaming the controversy and was concerned about getting negative reactions from the proponents of these things. And so there is a lot of ambivalence as to what is the best way to deal with it. And I don't really know what is the best way. I mean, my attitude and that of Barry Castleton is to try and get the facts out there and make them available. I mean, the internet has been a two-edged sword, really. It makes bad information more readily available, but good information is also more readily available. And if you point your patients in the right direction, then they'll often be quite happy reading it. And I've been overall generally pleasantly surprised by the fact that my patients seem on the whole to come up with genuine information rather than the wrong type, but it's of course not 100% true. Regulation of these things in Australia, no, I wouldn't say we're worse off than the US. I think you can't stop people popping up and making claims. I think one of the biggest issues is the media. Occasionally they act responsibly, quite frequently they act very irresponsibly. And one of the things I know the Cancer Council of Australia has been trying to do is to have seminars for health writers to try to teach them how you tell the sheep from the goats, the real from the false.
Next, over here. Yeah.
Are you aware of any quantum leap a quantum leap within the next 10 or 20 years in cancer treatment?
Oh, well, I think we're actually on the verge, I think, of a real revolution in cancer treatment. There's been a number of, there has been incremental improvement over the last 50 years without any doubt at all. For example, I just saw some figures recently that the average survival of a newly diagnosed breast cancer now is, the 5-year survival is now 85% for newly diagnosed breast cancer, whereas 30 years ago it was 70%, and it was less before that. And this has come about through increments. I mean, to get to the top of the landing, you have to walk up a number of steps, and most advances are incremental. They're not huge breakthroughs. The media, the general public, are always looking for breakthroughs. However, having said that, there have recently been some very important new developments based on the molecular revolution and our now molecular understanding of cancer, and there's a handful of drugs that work for a handful of cancers which are almost miraculous for people like me who've been working in the field for 30 years. One example you might have heard of is a drug called Herceptin for breast cancer, which is a drug designed to target, and these treatments are called targeted treatments, to target the molecular abnormality that's the fundamental basis of the cancer in a proportion of breast cancer patients. And this works in can shrink the cancer in a significant proportion of cases and significantly prolong life. There's other examples too, and there's a whole lot of research going on now. So I would think, yes, in 10 to 20 years' time there will be a huge difference in the survival of cancer, isn't that? Yes, I think that's true.
Yes, in the red cap.
A lot of mainstream doctors are sued when they stuff up. Does that happen with these alternative therapies? Are they often sued?
Almost never. Almost never. Very occasionally they get prosecuted. I'm sure the Reverend Marin, who's talking tomorrow, will tell you something about that. There was a naturopath in New South Wales who told the parents of a child with a heart complaint, parent of a newborn child with a heart complaint shouldn't have an operation and should be treated by energy wave and all this kind of stuff, and the child died. I believe that particular person was prosecuted, but it's a very rare thing. They don't belong to any organisation. They don't carry any insurance anyway. Suing them would be a waste of time almost always. So it almost never happens. It would be a good thing. And also, another thing that's a barrier to it is that a lot of people often interested in people who've gone to these practitioners, often still believe in the practitioner even though it didn't work in their particular case. So that they don't actually change their mind. It would be a very confronting emotionally, I guess, to come to a realisation or appreciation of what they invested so much time and energy and often money in was actually wrong.
Ray, you may recall a Victorian naturopath got convicted of murder 10 years ago because he buried a child in compost and has died of hypothermia. Next question. Yes, up the back there.
How do you feel about the current trend of the medical insurance companies starting to offer incentives, payouts for the alternative medicines or the alternative treatments? Do you think that's the thin end of a wedge?
I'm not sure I'm with you there, so explain it.
Some of the Medibank type companies.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. Yes. Sorry. Except medical insurance, I was thinking about indemnity insurance. Oh, yeah, well, it's not just the thin end of the wedge. I mean, it's well and truly wedged in. I mean, when I look, seeing we're all sort of, everyone above a certain income is more or less forced to have private insurance, I would like to take that insurance from a company that doesn't support the natural practice.